Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to another episode of the Road to Chess Mastery. Today we will be covering the final game in my 10th tournament, and currently I am 1 out of 4, not the greatest score, but I'm really hoping not to lose this last game because, well, 1 out of 5 is very, very sad. Um, anyways, so I am playing with the white pieces against Alina, and let's see how the game progresses. E4, E5, knight F3, and we already have a crossroads here. Normally we see the move knight to c6. This is very, very common. We've seen this many, many times. However, what was played in this game was knight to f6. Well, what is the difference? Well, knight to c6 is a developing move, develops your queen side, and it protects the e5 pawn. There are some downsides. It does block your c pawn, as normally in these types of positions, especially in the Italian, you can play a move like c3 and d4, whereas Black doesn't have the same options to go for c6 and d5. Although d5 is a break Black wants to play, it can't be supported easily with the c-pawn. Now, knight to f6 tries to avoid this and says, well, we are going to play a symmetrical position. However, we are going to possibly trade off these pawns, which is exactly what happens after knight takes e5. And the goal of Black trading off these two pawns is, well, it's a symmetrical position and there's not much advantage to be had here. And, well, it's an interesting idea, and let's see how the game continues. But this is a very, very good opening for Black to play. And let's just talk about knight takes e4, because this is a new opening, I believe, and we haven't talked about knight takes e4. Well, this one, immediately, this looks okay, but it's actually bad after queen to e2. Where after queen to e7, we are at the very least winning a pawn. d6, d4, takes, and as you can see, we're up a pawn. And, well, that's just the first line I looked at. There might even be better, but if you find one line and you're winning a pawn right out of the opening very easily, and it's a central pawn, it's going to be a good opening. Or it's going to be a bad move from your opponent. But okay, of course, the move d6 has to be played, where after knight to f3, you can play knight takes e4. Where now, queen to e2, queen to e7. The whole point here is, if we go back even further, where after knight takes e5, knight takes e4, the problem is you can't just retreat your knight, because there's a knight to c6 winning the queen. And this is important, as when we see this, where queen to e2 isn't really as effective, because queen e7 and the knight can retreat quite easily, and the queens are likely coming off, and this is perfectly fine for Black. But d4 is the most appropriate try. There's also knight to c3 here, which is also very, very interesting. But I went for d4, which is very classical. The whole point is, in this position, you want to attack this knight. Knight to c3 does that, and bishop to d3 does that. But the problem with bishop to d3 is it limits this bishop, and the fact that you can't play the move d4 and develop this bishop. So for example, bishop d3. Now we can see this bishop is never going to be developed on this diagonal, at least until we move this bishop and then move the pawn. But that's the whole point of d4. Where now a normal move like d5 can be played, bishop to d3. And although you don't really want to take on e4 anymore, because if you take, for example, let's just say c6, just a random move, taking on e4, taking knight to g5, for example, there's the move f5, and this may or may not be realistically good for Black, but you can't say this is not a very difficult position. For example, yeah, the move queen h5 doesn't really do anything after g6, but it could be a very scary position to deal with. But instead, my opponent played bishop to e7, so it's a very interesting move. It's a bit more uncommon, but d5 is usually the best approach. Anyways, bishop to d3, attacking the knight, and they retreat. After knight to f6, we see the move castles from me and castles from my opponent. I decided to play h3 here. I thought it was necessary. I just don't want to see any bishop to g4, as my bishop on d3 is good. It's looking at the h7 pawn. And playing a move like bishop g4, well, now this bishop really wants to move back to e2 to avoid the pin. For example, let's just say move like c3, bishop g4, and now we can see this pin is annoying. It's likely going to be okay, especially after a move like knight bd2 and then queen to c2, where the pin isn't as big of a deal, but this bishop can always reroute back to g6, and that's an ideal square for the piece. So h3 is just restricting this bishop from developing to both of these squares, or getting to the g6 square to limit the power of my own bishop. Anyways, now we see knight to c6. I played rook to e1. I thought this was just natural. The whole point is, well, I always have this f1 square for my bishop, which is necessary. A move like c3 is also playable here. I think both moves are okay, but I'm not going to really comment too much on rook e1. And now we see knight to b4, which is very interesting because now it forces my bishop to move back. This is exactly what I did. I played bishop to f1 because you want to keep the bishop here realistically. It doesn't make sense not to keep it. And then bishop to f5. So now they're attacking c2. They're threatening to win in exchange. There's two ways I can defend this. There's rook e2, which I was originally thinking. This looks like a very stupid move, but it does have a lot of purpose behind it. And well, the purpose behind it is you're covering c2 and you're saying, hey, you just played knight c6, knight b4, and bishop f5. Are you really going to take on c2 when you move these pieces how many times? When I just moved my rook, I just castled, which is more of a king move than a rook move, but 1, 2, whereas you wasted like 3 or 4 moves. And taking would not be good here for black. Because although we have the isolated pawn, we do have a lot of play and our pieces just completely dominate in this position. But instead I played knight to a3. I thought this was just a lot more solid, going for c3 and maybe a knight c2 to e3 maneuver, which is exactly what we see in the game. Rook e8 and c3, knight a6. So I really like this move, knight a6. I think the point of it is it does two things. It prepares a possible c5, but it also says, hey, you want to take on a6? And maybe the best option would be to take on a6, where you give your opponent a permanent weakness. However, there's actually some downsides to this, and I really respect my opponent for thinking it this way. Where the whole point is, well, a move like queen c8 does defend, and there's not really open lines to attack these pawns. But more importantly, this rook can now enter the game quite easily, and that's quite annoying. So I ended up not taking here. I played knight to c2, and we see c6. So instead of playing c5, my opponent is just going for knight c7 possibly, and remaneuvering to d5. We see knight to e3 from me. I'm just trying to attack this bishop, and I was expecting bishop g6, and h4 was highlighted, but I'm assuming the reason why bishop g6 was not played is because knight h4 wins the bishop pair, which is a fair assessment. I mean, it's a little worrisome to lose the bishop pair, but at the same time, this bishop isn't so great if you look at this type of pawn chain. What black wants to do is put their pawns on light squares, and the bishop's not going to do too much. So a move like d5, takes, and bishop to d3, well, sure, this bishop looks good, but it's hard to prove any realistic advantage here, even with the bishop pair. Even though it's possible to open the position, I would still say this is a very difficult position to prove any advantage. Maybe even bishop takes a6 would be interesting, getting rid of the bishop pair. Sorry, queen d3, queen to c8, for example. But okay, knight to e3 and bishop to d7 we see. And bishop to d7 is interesting because, well, they're just not allowing any trades like this, especially with the imbalance possibilities with knight to h4, because that would create a slight imbalance. But okay, bishop to d7, and they're still saying, hey, please take on a6, which I respect a lot, but I still didn't take. I played a4. I thought this was a natural move. I'm just trying to gain just a little bit of space. I mean, realistically, maybe the move bishop to d3 was a little bit stronger, but I just played a4 because it looked like a strong move that improved my position, controlled the b5 square, and just helps restrict my opponent just a little bit more. And now we see knight to c7, and we can see possible reroutes to d5 or just playing d5. And I think d5 would be a good move to play at some point. But I played bishop to d3. and bishop to f8. So now things are getting interesting. So nothing has really happened too much. I mean, this is realistically a pretty even position. However, we should look at the piece placements. I would say, well, first off, if we evaluate, these two pieces are even. These two pieces are even. So I'm just going to highlight these, actually. Oh, sorry, these. And then these two pieces are not even. And you might be thinking, what? These two pieces, but there's a dark squared bishop on c1. Well, you don't actually compare those two, because when we look at these pawn chains, we have to compare the bishops that are relative to those pawn chains. And my good bishop is better than their good bishop. This is their bad bishop. This is my bad bishop. And both are about even, but this bishop on d3 is more aggressive than their bishop on f8. So that's the whole idea behind the analysis here. But let's continue. So it might mean that I have a slight practical advantage, but realistically, this is pretty much even. It's just nice to look at those types of situations, as well as my pawn chain being slightly better as well for the queen side. You can say that h3 could be a weakness, but that's very difficult to prove. I played knight to f5. Originally, I was thinking knight to f1, but when you can make an aggressive move that does the exact same thing as a defensive or a regressive moves, aggressive, regressive, sure. Let's pretend I'm saying the right word there. But knight to f5 has the idea of knight to g3, but it has the added bonus. Hey, if you want to take and get rid of your bad bishop, it makes a lot of sense getting rid of your bad bishop. But you're also giving me the bishop pair, and you are, well, I mean, that should be enough of an idea here. Whereas otherwise, I can just move to g3, especially after a move like g6. I wouldn't mind, and just, develop naturally with a move like bishop to e3. But of course, my opponent took, and I don't really blame her for taking because, well, it's not a great piece, right? And my opponent is definitely lower on space than me, especially since d5 hasn't been played. And when you're lower on space, what you want to do is you want to trade. Because, well, if you trade when you have low space, you might actually have very few weaknesses, and your opponent with more space might end up having more weaknesses than you in an endgame. So, rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and queen to e8. Now, some of you who may know me may think, hey, he's just going to play queen takes e8 and be boring. Well, actually not quite. I played bishop to f4. I'm saying, hey, if you want to trade, I'm perfectly fine with trading. Now, since we're getting to an endgame, I do have the bishop here, and if I play a move like c4 and d5, or just try to open the position in any way, well, the bishop pair should prove to be advantageous, at least somewhat. But g6, and now, okay, sure, I'll take on e8 now, take on e8, and bishop to d3. But the whole point is now, after taking, although they have the open file, there's not really anything here for them to gain because every square is defended. Knight f to d5 and bishop to d2. Bishop to d2 is just a nice move when you look at the knight on d5 because it just perfectly blocks out this piece. So it's one of those moves where two pawns between the knight and the bishop, if they're on the same file or on the same rank, then it's normally going to be good. So that's something you want to aim for. Anyways, now we see knight to e6, and we need to focus on restriction. We have the bishop pair, which is a slight advantage, but we need to improve our advantage further. And the way we can do this is by restricting our opponents and giving them more options. The more options your opponent has, sounds counterintuitive, but the more options you give your opponent, in that when you restrict their options and let them come up with ideas, they'll often make mistakes. And this sounds a little confusing, but let me rephrase. After the move g3, we are restricting their plans. And even though we're taking away an option, we're also saying, hey, we're not going for anything concrete. We're not going for a move like c4 here. Where c4, they have obvious ideas of possibly knight to f4. And we don't want to force action when we don't need to, because in this position, a move like g3, well, sure, they now have the move and it is up to them to find something, but it's also up to them to find something here. And we can make slow improving moves while our opponent also tries to make slow improving moves. But if they don't, and they don't know what the position's about, then that can heavily favor us. We see h6, king to g2. So I'm just trying to improve my king. Again, slow improving moves. That's what the position's all about. And now we see a mistake from my opponent. I truly believe this was the losing move. And this was f5. And it might not seem like such a bad move, but there's quite a few problems. The first problem is g6 is weak. Yes, g6 is weak. We will get to that. But so is g5. And the whole point of this position is you need to find out how to weaken the structure further. And the way we can do this is by sacrificing a pawn. With the move h4. h4, how does that sacrifice a pawn? Well, let's be clear. This move specifically doesn't. But it encourages the move h5. And this benefits us because now the g5 square is weak, and now we actually have something to play around. It might not be much, but it's something. And it's not something we had before f5. Before f5, there's 0 weaknesses for both sides. But after f5, now we have an idea. And after king f7, I would say we're winning. And this was the last chance where realistically, h4, it's holdable. If you play a move like h5, then you can grovel. But after king f7, it's over. And the reason it's over is because of the pawn sacrifice h5, which was the whole idea behind h4, is you want to just, if you could play h3 to h5 in one move, then that would be the immediate winning move after f5, but you have to make it in 2 moves. But it's so worth it in this position to play that it's just necessary. And here we can see the g6 pawn is overloaded, and there's not much, unfortunately, that black can do here. My opponent played g5, which just hangs the f5 pawn, but the whole point is, no matter what, let's just say a waiting move. Unfortunately, this doesn't work because knight to h4 just picks up the pawn, and we will be winning a pawn no matter what here. And if they were to take, well, after we take, the thing is this pawn is super weak. We can now play rook to h1 and just use the h-file, which is great because we played the move king to g1 or king to g2, so we have fewer moves to worry about here, and all of our pieces are perfectly placed. We're going to play rook h1. Realistically, we're going to win another pawn or just win a pawn, and this h6 pawn is a huge weakness in the position. But okay, g5. We took on f5 and are now threatening bishop to g6, but of course our opponent avoids this with king to f6. I played bishop g6 anyways. It's a tempo, and we need to get our pieces into the game. However, after rook to e7, we need to sit for a second here and think, how can we actually improve our advantage? And we can do this in an interesting way. I played knight to h2 in the game. I think this is okay. There's still an obvious advantage here for white because we are up a pawn. But there's the move c4. And this is just winning. It's crazy to think, but this is just a winning move. I was very hesitant to play this. I saw this in the game, but I didn't see the follow-up. But after knight d to c7, or knight to a6, it shouldn't matter, d5. And this is surprising because after takes, there's bishop to c3 check. And, well, we're just winning the house here. d4, we win our pawn back. King to e5 gets immediately mated with knight to f3. I just thought I'd point this out. So there's no trying that. But after takes, and king to e6, bishop takes a7, we are now 2 pawns up. And, well, this is just crushing because we have the bishop pair, beautifully active pieces, and what can be done realistically. For example, bishop g7, just rook e1, just trade, why not? And if bishop e5, well, unfortunately that runs into f4, and the bishop is lost. But, okay, rook to e7. I played knight to h2, going for knight g4 check. I mean, it is an improvement of the piece, but c4 is just a crusher. And knight g4. Unfortunately, c4 also works here. It's a little different, but knight to g4 check. King to e6 is kind of the only move again. And bishop to d3. And as you can see here, just looking at this position, we can tell this has to be very, very bad for black. Again, we're up a pawn and their king is just in the center, but it's really awkward because there's still a lot of pieces on the board. It just doesn't look optically good. But knight to g4 and king g7. So after rook e1, the advantage kind of fizzled out. However, we're still up a pawn, and this was my thought process going into this position. Is sure, I'm up a pawn and I might have had something more concrete, but the good thing here is, while I'm up a pawn, I still have the bishop here, and I have no weaknesses, and I can still make slow improving moves, which is all absolutely fair. It's just, you know, when you see a win, or if you miss a win, it's unfortunate, right? Kind of ruins the flavor of the game. But now we see knight to f6, king to f3. The whole point is, yes, you can trade, which, you know, I still have my bishop here. Now my king is on g4. It's not the worst piece in the world. Knight takes g4, king takes g4, as we see. It's a nice place piece. King to f6 and bishop to d2. And the whole point of this move is I'm trying to go for a possible f4. Though you could argue that f4 is also good here. The whole point is after takes, then we can play bishop to h4. Which is something that I kind of realized after bishop d2, knight e6. I kind of realized, yeah, I should have just played f4 immediately. But I played f4 here. Bishop f5. I'm just trying to trade off this piece, because if we can make sure we don't get into an opposite color bishop ending, that's more important right now. And if we get into same color bishops while I'm up a pawn, I'm hoping to win. Though realistically, it's a lot harder to prove an advantage now, as their king is quite well placed. But they took on f4. I took back with the g pawn. Bishop g7, bishop e1, going for bishop h4. And the whole idea behind this is, okay, I'm not going to be able to do what I did before, but what I can do here is I can try to have bishop versus knight, which is a bigger imbalance, and maybe we'll be able to prove my advantage further. King f7, bishop g6, king e7, and bishop h4. And now the whole point is I'm essentially just trying to trade off this bishop for this bishop, where I have, again, the bishop versus knight. There might even be a king f5, but it doesn't really do too much in this position. It's really hard to prove anything here. It's just hard to find a follow-up. Maybe bishop to f2, for example. But all of my pieces are kind of not really too well placed. I might have to reroute to like e3, play bishop g6. It's a whole thing, and this might be best, but it's just too complicated for me. So I ended up going for bishop h4 and takes. b3. b3, I'm not sure why I played it realistically. It just looks like a natural move, I guess. It's something you can't really explain, but a5 now. Maybe a5 was actually better here for me. But a5, you have to be very careful. Because if the knight can remaneuver to, say, b5, then there could be problems. But b3 now, a5 and bishop to f5, where now we see b6, and I took. And after takes and f5 and king f7, I am winning. All right, well, I'm back. My battery on my camera just died, but as I was saying, in this position, white is winning, and it's a little interesting after f5, king f7. The important move here to play, very natural, is not king f3. Why is king f3 not a good move here? Well, because after a move like king f6, or for example b5, well, there's not really anything to prove here anymore. King f6, king f5, and b5, and now black has the opposition with this move, and unfortunately there's not much you can do, because you can't take, because now a4 is coming, and realistically black can be winning there. But we just have to shuffle, and that's realistically all we can do here. King g7, for example, and this should be a draw. Unfortunately, yeah. So that's unfortunate. But after king f4, we are threatening king e5, so king f6 has to be played, but now we have the move b4. And this is the key move here, because now if they take, we have the move a5 and we are winning. But alright, after king f7, we have king f3, king e7, king f4, king to d6, and now b4 I ended up playing. So I saw the idea, but it took me a little bit of time there. b5 unfortunately does not work. It looks natural because, well, their king is in time to catch my a pawn, whereas I'm not in time to catch theirs. But there's something that they missed. After takes a6, king c7, a7, king b7. I can promote. Very key move here. Where after I promote, what is the difference between promoting and not promoting and just playing f6? Is their king will be attacked with check. So after takes, f6, a3, f7, a2, weak queen with check, and we can pick up the pawn. And this is exactly what happens in this position. And now this is just a very straightforward win. Not going to go over too much. Just queen c6, queen d7. Bring in our king and queen b7 with mate. And that was the game. It was quite a wild ride. There's a lot of intricacies to this one. I would say the biggest thing that we should take away from this game is, well, make sure you calculate. Make sure you look at the critical lines, because again, I had this option. I would say this sacrifices, this h4, h5 sacrifice is very important as well. It's a very important lesson, but it's not the only thing I would worry about here. I would say if we're trying to improve ourselves from this game, because it's something I already saw, my biggest lesson that I would have to take away is just going back and realizing I shouldn't have played knight f2. I shouldn't have traded rooks. My opponent's position, look at this bishop. It's just it's blocked in by the rook. It's blocked in by the pawn. It's just a terrible piece. It's really just a pawn that can't promote. It's useless. But if we play a move like c4, we can get a significant advantage here. And unfortunately, it's not something I played. But what happens, happens, right? It's unfortunate, but I ended up still winning, so that was nice. And okay, it was definitely a really cool game to see, because there's a lot of intricate things that happen, and I think I made a lot of good and bad moves. But anyways, that's it for this tournament, and I will see you in tournament number 11, and we'll have a good one, guys. See you then.